In the turbulent and fractured world of 12th century Japan, where clans vied for power and the country was torn between war and shifting allegiances, there existed a figure whose legend would defy the very conventions of her time. She was a woman, a warrior, and a symbol of resistance in an era dominated by men. Her name was Tomoe Gozen, a samurai unlike any other. Born into the chaos of the Genpei War, she would rise to prominence not merely as a skilled fighter, but as a force that would alter the course of history. To understand Tomoe's extraordinary journey, one must first understand the backdrop against which she emerged. Japan during the late Heian period was a land in turmoil, gripped by the struggle between two powerful clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Genpei War, which raged from 1180 to 1185, was more than just a military conflict. It was a war for the soul of Japan, a struggle between two rival factions, each with its own vision of the future. It was in this volatile atmosphere that Tomoe Gozen found her purpose. Her origins, though somewhat shrouded in mystery, are often linked to the Minamoto clan. Some legends suggest that she was born into a samurai family of minor nobility, while others speculate that she was an adopted daughter of the famous Minamoto general, Minamoto no Yoshinaka. Regardless of the specifics of her birth, what is clear is that Tomoe was no ordinary woman. By the time she was a young adult, she had already proven herself to be an extraordinary warrior. Skilled in the arts of archery, swordsmanship, and horsemanship, Tomoe became known for her unmatched bravery on the battlefield. But what truly set her apart from the other samurai of her time was not just her combat prowess, but her ability to lead and inspire. The Genpei War was a brutal and relentless conflict, characterized by long sieges, ambushes, and clashes that seemed endless. For most of the women of the period, war was something that happened far away from the domestic sphere. They were expected to tend to the home, raise children, and support their husbands or fathers in more passive ways. Yet, for Tomoe, the battlefield was a place where she could wield power, defy societal expectations, and prove her worth not just as a woman, but as a warrior in her own right. Her first major military involvement came under the command of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, who, despite being a lesser-known leader in the Minamoto clan, would come to rely heavily on Tomoe's abilities. During the Battle of Fujigawa in 1180, Tomoe made her mark on history. As part of Yoshinaka's forces, she fought fiercely against the Taira army, earning a reputation for her deadly precision with the bow and her fearlessness in hand-to-hand combat. One particular story from the battle remains a defining moment in her legacy. As Yoshinaka's forces were engaged in a fierce melee with the Taira, it is said that Tomoe, mounted on her horse, slew a formidable Taira warrior with a single, well-aimed arrow. This act of valor, though one of many in her career, would forever cement her reputation as a warrior of exceptional skill and courage. As the war raged on, Tomoe's role within the Minamoto clan expanded. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a leader. In several battles, she served as a commander, rallying the troops and leading them into combat with both precision and passion. Her presence on the battlefield was said to be awe-inspiring. Tall, with long flowing hair, Tomoe was often described as a woman of striking beauty as well as immense strength. She fought with a fervor and tenacity that made her an unstoppable force, and to those around her, she was not just a woman, she was a symbol of hope and defiance. Despite her growing influence, Tomoe's rise was not without complications. The very society in which she lived was one that relegated women to the shadows of history. The samurai class, where honor and martial prowess were revered above all else, was male-dominated. Women had a role, but it was not on the front lines of war. They were expected to be caretakers, to support their men and children, and to hold the fort when necessary. To break these expectations was almost unthinkable, yet Tomoe did just that. Her ability to navigate this deeply patriarchal society, where women were not typically seen as warriors, made her an anomaly in the history of Japan's samurai tradition. Her story was not merely one of exceptional combat skill, but also one of defiance. Tomoe Gozen fought not just for her survival, but for a larger cause, the challenge to the role of women in feudal Japan and the redefinition of what it meant to be a warrior. Her story would echo for generations, inspiring women and men alike to rethink the boundaries of gender and power. The Battle of Owazu in 1184 would be a defining moment in Tomoe's journey, both as a warrior and as a symbol of the Minamoto cause. The Minamoto army, now led by Yoshinaka, was engaged in a critical confrontation with the forces of the Taira clan. It was here that Tomoe's abilities were put to the ultimate test. The battle was long and grueling, and the tide began to turn against the Minamoto. Despite their courage, the Minamoto forces were on the brink of defeat. At a pivotal moment in the battle, Yoshinaka's troops were being overwhelmed, and it appeared that all hope was lost. In a final act of bravery, Tomoe, refusing to surrender, led a small band of warriors in a last-ditch effort to defend their retreating army. Some accounts suggest that she personally slew a group of Taira soldiers, including one of the enemy commanders, before making her escape. But as the war reached its conclusion, Tomoe's fate would take a different turn. While she had proven herself time and again as a warrior, a commander, and a leader, the aftermath of the war would see her fading from the historical record. Some versions of her story suggest that she was granted a reward for her service, possibly land or a position in the Minamoto clan's administration, but her ultimate fate remains unclear. What is certain, however, is that Tomoe Gozen's legacy would endure. Though she would not rise to the same prominence as some of her male counterparts, her name would be etched into the annals of history, remembered as a symbol of resilience, defiance, and extraordinary skill. Her story transcends the simple narrative of a woman in battle. It is a story of a woman who defied the expectations of her time and created her own path, a path that would forever alter the perception of women in the warrior class. Her legacy lives on not just in the pages of history, but in the hearts of those who believe that true strength lies not in one's gender, but in one's spirit. The world of the Genpei War was one of constant movement and upheaval. Shifting allegiances, betrayals, and the relentless pursuit of power characterized the era. And for Tomoe Gozen, this was a world in which she would continue to carve out her place, fighting not just for survival, but for the legacy of her people. With her rise as a warrior, the story of Tomoe expanded beyond personal valor to encompass a broader struggle. The conflict between two mighty clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. This war, which had already seen much bloodshed, would soon be marked by Tomoe's indelible influence. As the Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoshinaka, moved deeper into enemy territory, Tomoe's role in their military campaigns became more central. The Genpei War was not merely a series of battles. It was a clash of ideals, a contest for the soul of Japan. At the heart of this contest was not just the military prowess of the combatants, but the very nature of what it meant to be a samurai, and even more provocatively, what it meant to be a woman within that code. Tomoe was an anomaly, a woman in a male-dominated sphere, showing both men and women alike what it meant to fight with honor and purpose. Her presence on the battlefield was not only a symbol of strength, but also a challenge to the accepted norms of samurai society. As the Minamoto forces, led by Yoshinaka, pushed forward in their campaign against the Taira, the stakes of the war intensified. With each battle, the consequences grew more severe, and the toll on both sides mounted. However, for Tomoe, the escalating violence only seemed to sharpen her focus. In her mind, there was no question she was there to win. She was there to fight for her people, for the Minamoto cause, and above all, for herself. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight to prove that her place in history was not defined by her gender, but by her skill, her loyalty, and her conviction. One of the pivotal moments in Tomoe's story occurred during the Battle of Kurikura, a crucial confrontation between the Minamoto and the Taira in 1183. As the Minamoto forces advanced toward the Taira stronghold, they faced a formidable opposition. The Taira, led by the cunning and ruthless Taira no Kayamori, had become a powerful dynasty, but their rule was increasingly threatened by the growing power of the Minamoto. The Battle of Kurakara was a turning point for both sides. For the Minamoto, it was a moment of opportunity. For the Taira, it was a critical point of resistance. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy losses, but it was also the moment when Tomoe Gozen would fully emerge as a key figure in the Minamoto army. The battle itself was marked by chaos, a whirlwind of sword strikes, arrows, and desperate cries for victory. In the midst of this chaos, Tomoe fought with a singular focus, cutting through the Taira forces with precision and strength. Her skill with the bow was unmatched, and her expertise in hand-to-hand combat allowed her to hold her own against the best of the Taira warriors. One of the most celebrated stories from this battle involves Tomoe's slaying of a formidable Taira warrior. Mounted on her horse, she charged through the ranks, cutting down her enemies with swift, graceful strokes. The story of her bravery on the battlefield spread quickly, and soon her name became synonymous with Minamoto's growing power. But as her legend spread, so too did the complexities of her role in the war. The Genpei War, with all its brutality, was a male-dominated sphere. The samurai code, known as Bushido, emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor, but also had strict gender expectations. Women, particularly those of noble birth, were not supposed to fight. They were expected to remain in the background, overseeing household affairs, managing domestic matters, and ensuring the family survival. The story of Tomoe Gozen, however, was one that defied these conventions. She was not content to remain behind the scenes. She wanted to fight. She wanted to prove herself on her own terms. She wanted to show that honor was not confined to the male warriors around her, but could be embodied by anyone, regardless of gender. In the midst of this, Tomoe's relationship with Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the leader of the Minamoto clan, also deepened. Yoshinaka recognized her exceptional skill and bravery, relying on her not only as a fighter, but also as a leader. Tomoe's presence on the battlefield became symbolic. She represented the ideals of loyalty and honor that the Minamoto clan espoused, and her dedication to the cause made her one of Yoshinaka's most trusted warriors. Though she was not his only general, her presence commanded the respect of those who fought alongside her. Many of the Minamoto soldiers looked to her as a figure of inspiration. They saw in her a strength that transcended gender and status, a living embodiment of what it meant to be a warrior. As the conflict escalated, the stakes continued to rise. The battle for control of Japan was no longer just a military struggle. It was becoming a struggle for identity, for what it meant to belong to a clan, to uphold one's honor, and a fight for one's ideals. For Tomoe, this was no longer just about the Minamoto. It was about proving that women could be just as formidable as men in the world of the samurai. But it was also about something more personal, a desire to prove that her place on the battlefield was earned not through her gender, but through her deeds. With each victory, Tomoe's reputation grew. As she fought alongside Yoshinaka and the Minamoto forces, her feats of strength, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and her relentless pursuit of victory became the stuff of legend. The tales of her skill with the bow and her prowess in battle spread across the land, and soon she was no longer just a warrior. She was a symbol of resistance. Tomoe Gozen represented the challenge to the status quo, the embodiment of a woman who refused to accept her prescribed role in a patriarchal society. Yet, as with all wars, victories are fleeting and the cost of battle is high. The Minamoto clan's fortunes would soon take a dramatic turn, and so too would Tomoe's place in the narrative. The ebb and flow of battle would bring her to a crossroads, where the decisions made on the field of war would shape not only her own future, but the future of Japan itself. But as the Minamoto forces faced increasing opposition from the Taira, Tomoe found herself at the forefront of a changing world. She was not just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a legacy. The ideals she embodied, strength, loyalty, and courage, would continue to inspire future generations. And while her immediate fate would become clouded in the shifting tides of war, Tomoe's place in history was assured. Whether or not the Minamoto would ultimately triumph in their struggle against the Terra, Tomoe Gozen's story would endure. It would be remembered as the story of a woman who defied the conventions of her time and showed the world that women, too, could stand shoulder to shoulder with the fiercest warriors in the land. Through the bloodshed and the shifting alliances, Tomoe Gozen's name would live on as a testament to the power of defiance, the strength of conviction, and the courage of a woman who refused to be anything less than what she was, a warrior. As the conflict between the Minamoto and Terra clans deepened, the war became not just a contest for power, but a story of survival, loyalty, and sacrifice. For Tomoe Gozen, the battlefield was where she would continue to prove herself, not just as a warrior, but as a figure central to the Minamoto cause. Her bravery, already legendary, would only grow as the war's intensity reached new heights. Yet as the tides of battle turned, Tomoe found herself at a crossroads, caught between the ideal she had fought for and the grim reality of war. By the time the Minamoto forces reached the Battle of Owazu in 1184, the war had reached a critical juncture. After a series of hard-fought engagements, the Minamoto, under the leadership of Yoshinaka, had managed to gain some ground against the Terra. However, the Terra were not a clan easily defeated. Their hold on the imperial court and their vast network of supporters made them a formidable adversary, and they would not relinquish control without a final, desperate effort. The Battle of Owazu, a defining confrontation of the Genpei War, would be one of the last major conflicts of the struggle. For Tomoe Gozen, it would prove to be both a test of her combat skills and a moment of reckoning. The battle itself was chaotic, a desperate and brutal fight for survival. The Minamoto forces, led by Yoshinaka, were facing a Terra army that was determined to press its advantage and push the Minamoto back. The battle took place in the rolling hills near the Owazu River, and the terrain was treacherous, offering few advantages to either side. The armies clashed with the intensity and ferocity that had come to define the Genpei War. The air was thick with the sounds of clashing swords, the whine of arrows cutting through the air, and the battle cries of soldiers locked in mortal combat. Amidst the turmoil, Tomoe stood out. Mounted on her horse, she cut through the Terra forces with unmatched precision, her bowstring snapping with each release, sending arrows into the hearts of her enemies. Her reputation for both archery and swordsmanship had preceded her, and those who saw her fight could not help but marvel at her prowess. In a world where few women had the opportunity to fight, Tomoe's courage and skill on the battlefield became something more than just a matter of military value. It was a symbol, a testament to the breaking of traditional gender roles and the capacity of women to wield power in a world dominated by men. She was no longer merely a soldier in the Minamoto army. She was an icon. But as the battle raged on, the Minamoto forces found themselves in dire straits. The Terra, led by their general, Terra no Kayamori, were relentless, and their numbers seemed to overwhelm the Minamoto troops. Despite Tomoe's fierce resistance and her exemplary leadership on the battlefield, the Minamoto forces began to falter. Yoshinaka, despite his strategic acumen, was unable to turn the tide. In the heat of the battle, Yoshinaka's army began to collapse under the weight of Terra's assault. Desperate for a decisive victory, Yoshinaka pushed his forces forward, hoping to break the Terra lines. But the outcome was inevitable. Tomoe, ever loyal, continued to fight at the forefront of the conflict, leading her men with the same resolve and fearlessness that had marked her rise through the ranks of the Minamoto. But even she could not stop the inevitable defeat. As the battle reached its climax, Yoshinaka, who had once been the leader of the Minamoto forces, was surrounded by Terra soldiers. In a desperate attempt to survive, he attempted to flee, but the Terra were relentless. His forces were shattered, and the Minamoto army, once full of hope, was left scattered and broken. In the midst of this chaos, Tomoe made the difficult decision to leave the battlefield, knowing that her survival and the survival of her men were in jeopardy. Some legends claim that Tomoe, seeing the inevitable collapse of the Minamoto forces, mounted a final stand, cutting down any Terra warrior who approached her. Others say she led a small group of survivors in a retreat, choosing to live to fight another day. But whatever the specifics, Tomoe's role in the Battle of Owazu marked a significant turning point. It was clear that, despite her extraordinary abilities and indomitable will, the tide of the war was shifting and the Minamoto were losing. In the aftermath of the battle, Tomoe's place in the Minamoto narrative became more complex. Despite the defeat, her actions during the war had established her as a legendary figure, and her deeds on the battlefield would be remembered as some of the most remarkable feats of the entire conflict. Her decision to leave the battle and survive would be seen as an act of pragmatism rather than defeat. Unlike many other warriors who were consumed by the glory of battle, Tomoe understood that there were times when survival was the key to continuing the struggle. She had fought fiercely for the Minamoto cause, and now, as the conflict shifted, her fight was far from over. The defeat at Owazu marked a pivotal moment in the Genpei War, not only for the Minamoto but also for Tomoe Gozen. The Taira, buoyed by their victory, pressed their advantage, and the Minamoto were forced into retreat. The fate of the Minamoto clan now rested in the hands of its remaining leaders, but for Tomoe, the battle was far from over. In the aftermath of the defeat, the Minamoto forces scattered, their unity shattered. But Tomoe, far from retreating into the shadows, became a figure of resilience. She had fought for the Minamoto cause not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of what the clan stood for: loyalty, courage, and the refusal to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. As the war reached its final stages, Tomoe's role in the larger conflict would become increasingly uncertain. The Minamoto forces, weakened and dispersed, were unable to mount a final, decisive strike against the Taira. The tide of history was shifting, and the Minamoto clan's hold on power was slipping. Tomoe's fate, once so closely tied to the Minamoto cause, was now in question. Despite her unparalleled skill and courage, there was no longer a clear path forward for her within the clan. Though her role in the war may have seemed to be coming to an end, Tomoe Gozen's legacy was far from fading. Her story continued to inspire those who heard it, and her deeds on the battlefield were etched into the collective memory of the people. She had defied the expectations of her time, breaking the constraints of gender and proving that a woman could be as formidable a warrior as any man. Her strength, courage, and determination would forever be remembered, not just as the story of a samurai woman, but as the story of a person who refused to be defined by anything other than her actions. Tomoe Gozen's journey would come to an end, but her place in the history of Japan and in the mythos of the samurai would endure. Whether she lived out her days in obscurity or continued to play a role in the remnants of the Minamoto struggle, her story would remain a testament to the power of defiance, to the strength that can be found in even the most uncertain of times, and to the unyielding spirit of a woman who refused to be anything less than a warrior. As the war dragged on and the Minamoto clan faced the increasingly formidable Taira forces, the balance of power in Japan began to shift. The earlier optimism that had buoyed the Minamoto warriors in the beginning of the Genpei War was now marred by the harsh reality of a protracted conflict, with casualties mounting on both sides. For Tomoe Gozen, the relentless toll of the war had begun to weigh heavily on her, yet she remained undeterred in her resolve to continue the fight. Her remarkable feats on the battlefield had earned her renown, but as the tides of war turned ever more decisively in favor of the Taira, Tomoe faced new challenges, ones that would test not only her martial prowess but her place within the ever-changing landscape of the war. Despite their previous successes, the Minamoto were now struggling under the leadership of Yoshinaka, who had once been a promising figure for the clan. The once unified forces had fractured, with infighting and dissent weakening their resolve. Tomoe, however, had always remained steadfast in her loyalty to the Minamoto cause. Her belief in the importance of honor, duty, and the pursuit of justice remained unshaken, even as the war began to shift toward the final stages. The conflict, which had begun as a battle for dominance between two powerful families, had now become a war of attrition, a fight for survival, where the cost of victory seemed almost unbearable. As the Minamoto forces were pressed into retreat, Tomoe found herself increasingly isolated. The loss of her comrades and the disbanding of the once proud Minamoto army meant that she was now forced to rely not just on her combat skills, but on her resourcefulness. The tactics that had once brought the Minamoto victories, surprise attacks, swift strikes, and decisive action, were no longer enough to turn the tide. Instead, Tomoe's survival depended on her ability to adapt to an ever-changing and increasingly hostile environment. The shifting nature of the war also had significant implications for Tomoe's relationship with the Minamoto leadership. Her bond with Yoshinaka, once a central part of her story, began to erode as the tide of the conflict turned against them. Yoshinaka, whose strategic brilliance had once been admired, became increasingly desperate, and his leadership faltered under the pressure of mounting defeats. It became clear that, despite her courage and skill, Tomoe could no longer rely on Yoshinaka to lead the Minamoto forces to victory. The internal struggles of the Minamoto clan, compounded by the increasing strength of the Taira, made it apparent that the war was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The tension between the ideals of honor and the practical realities of war became ever more apparent. Amidst the growing uncertainty, Tomoe's role within the Minamoto clan became more complicated. While her reputation as a warrior continued to grow, her standing within the clan was increasingly questioned. The samurai code of honor, which placed such emphasis on loyalty and duty, now began to seem like a distant ideal, lost in the face of overwhelming adversity. Tomoe, ever the loyal warrior, had fought for the Minamoto cause from the beginning of the war, but now, as the conflict reached its most desperate moments, she found herself at a crossroads. The ideals that had once guided her, loyalty, bravery, and honor, were increasingly being overshadowed by the harsh realities of war. The Minamoto clan, weakened and fractured, faced a growing crisis of leadership. With Yoshinaka's forces scattered and morale low, it became clear that the Minamoto could no longer mount a coordinated defense against the Taira. Tomoe, who had once been a symbol of the Minamoto's strength, was now faced with a difficult decision. Should she continue to fight for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless, or should she seek a different path, one that would allow her to preserve her honor and her life? For a woman like Tomoe, whose entire existence had been defined by battle and the pursuit of honor, this was not an easy choice. As the Minamoto clan continued to crumble, Tomoe's place in the narrative of the war became more fluid. She had already demonstrated her extraordinary skill and unwavering loyalty to the cause, but now her future seemed uncertain. The war was coming to a close, and Tomoe's role in it was rapidly changing. With Yoshinaka defeated and the Minamoto forces scattered, she had no clear leader to follow. The once proud warrior, who had commanded respect on the battlefield, was now faced with the difficult reality of survival in a world that had little room for the fallen. It was during this time that Tomoe's personal journey began to intersect more directly with the political realities of the war. With the Minamoto forces in disarray and the Taira gaining the upper hand, Tomoe's survival depended not only on her martial abilities, but on her ability to navigate the shifting alliances and allegiances of fractured Japan. As the war ground to a slow and painful conclusion, the question of what would become of Tomoe and her legacy became ever more pressing. The final stages of the Genpei War would see the ultimate triumph of the Taira clan. Despite Tomoe's extraordinary contributions to the Minamoto cause, the Taira would ultimately emerge victorious. The Taira's hold on the imperial court and their superior resources proved too much for the Minamoto to overcome. As the last remnants of the Minamoto clan were scattered or destroyed, Tomoe's future became uncertain. What would become of her now? Some accounts suggest that Tomoe, having fought tirelessly for the Minamoto cause, may have chosen to withdraw from the battlefield, retiring to a life of quiet reflection. Others speculate that she continued to fight, albeit in a more isolated capacity, perhaps in the service of another cause or clan. In the end, the exact fate of Tomoe Gozen remains a mystery. Some legends claim that she was granted a position of honor within the Minamoto clan after the war's conclusion, perhaps living out her days as a respected figure in the court or as a warrior in a more subdued capacity. Others suggest that she may have taken up a life in seclusion, far removed from the violence of the war. What is clear, however, is that her legacy endured long after the final battle had been fought. Tomoe Gozen's story became a symbol of the power of defiance, the strength of will, and the ability to transcend the limitations imposed by society. Despite the uncertainties surrounding her final years, Tomoe Gozen's place in history is secure. She remains one of the most iconic figures in Japan's samurai tradition, her name immortalized in stories, songs, and legends. In a time when women were often relegated to the background, Tomoe's story stands as a powerful testament to the possibility of breaking barriers and achieving greatness, even in the most hostile of environments. Her role in the Genpei War, though ultimately overshadowed by the Taira's victory, remains a critical part of Japan's history. Tomoe Gozen, the warrior woman who defied the norms of her time, remains a symbol of courage, strength, and resilience, a woman who stood tall in a world that sought to diminish her. Though the war may have ended with the Taira's victory, Tomoe's legacy would continue to inspire generations of warriors, men and women alike, reminding them that true strength is not defined by one's gender or the circumstances of their birth, but by the strength of their spirit. As the final chapters of the Genpei War unfolded, the last remnants of the once mighty Minamoto clan were scattered across the landscape, defeated and broken. The clash of these two great families, the Minamoto and the Taira, had reached its climax. The war, which had begun as a desperate struggle for power, now seemed to be winding down toward a grim and inevitable conclusion. The Taira, with their superior resources, overwhelming numbers, and control over the imperial court, were on the verge of securing victory. Yet, despite the almost insurmountable odds, the story of Tomoe Gozen, the legendary samurai woman, remained intertwined with the fate of the Minamoto cause. She had become a living legend, not just for her skill on the battlefield, but for the ideals she embodied: honor, courage, and an unyielding spirit. Her role in the final stages of the war would define not only her legacy, but also the future of the samurai warrior class. For Tomoe, the war had always been more than just a series of battles. It had been a test of character, a means of proving that honor was not the sole domain of men. Her very existence as a female warrior in a world dominated by male samurai had been a challenge to the established order. From the moment she had first picked up a sword, Tomoe had shown the world that the limitations placed on women were arbitrary and irrelevant in the face of true strength and determination. Her skill with the bow, her ferocity in close combat, and her ability to inspire those around her had made her an icon of the Minamoto cause. Yet, as the war drew to its close, the world that had once revered her as a symbol of defiance seemed to be slipping away. The Minamoto clan was on the brink of extinction, and Tomoe, once one of its brightest stars, was now left to navigate the uncertain terrain of a world in transition. The final months of the war were marked by a sense of inevitability. The Taira had won the crucial battles and secured their hold on power. The Minamoto, whose forces had been decimated and scattered, were now in full retreat. Tomoe, ever the warrior, refused to accept defeat. She had fought valiantly for the Minamoto cause, but as the remnants of the clan were driven into exile or killed, her future became increasingly uncertain. She had once been a central figure in the Minamoto army, commanding respect and loyalty from those around her. Now, she was a woman without a cause, a warrior without a clan. Yet, despite this, Tomoe's indomitable spirit remained unbroken. She had lived through the most harrowing of battles, witnessed the fall of her comrades, and yet she still clung to the hope that there was something more to be done. In the face of the Taira's growing dominance, Tomoe's loyalty to the Minamoto cause was unwavering. She had fought with all her heart, and now, in the twilight of the war, she continued to serve as a reminder of what the Minamoto had once stood for. Her deeds on the battlefield had been legendary, and despite the dire situation, her name still carried weight among the few remaining Minamoto warriors. She had become more than just a warrior. She had become a symbol, a living testament to the ideals of honor and courage. For Tomoe, the battle was not yet over. Even if the war itself seemed lost, she would continue to fight for those ideals. For her, survival was not a matter of retreating into the shadows. It was about preserving the legacy of the Minamoto clan, ensuring that their memory would live on, even if their military ambitions had failed. Amidst the defeat and disillusionment of the final days of the Genpei War, Tomoe's actions became increasingly reflective of her inner turmoil. Her struggle was no longer just against the Terra or the physical forces arrayed against her. It was a battle with herself. What was her purpose now? Could she continue to fight for a lost cause, or had her place in history already been sealed? These questions echoed through her mind as she moved through the last vestiges of the war, her heart torn between her loyalty to the fallen Minamoto cause and the desire to preserve her honor. Despite the mounting losses and the seemingly inevitable victory of the Terra, Tomoe did not retreat into the obscurity that many would have expected from a warrior in her position. Instead, she became one of the last figures of resistance. She fought not for the military victories that had once seemed so close, but for the principle that had always guided her: honor. Even as the Minamoto clan faltered, Tomoe refused to abandon her identity as a samurai. Her presence on the battlefield, though less frequent, continued to inspire those who fought alongside her. She became a symbol of perseverance, a beacon of hope in a world that seemed to have lost its way. There are few historical records that detail what happened to Tomoe after the final battles of the Genpei War. Many of the accounts surrounding her life are steeped in legend, and her fate has been the subject of much speculation. Some say that after the war, she went into seclusion, choosing to live out her days away from the violence and chaos that had defined her life. Others believe that she may have found a new cause to fight for, possibly in the service of a new clan or perhaps as a leader of her own people. There are also rumors that she may have taken up a role in the imperial court, using her knowledge of warfare and strategy to advise those in power. Regardless of the specifics of her fate, one thing is certain: Tomoe Gozen's legacy would never fade. Her life had spanned a period of profound transformation for Japan. The Genpei War was not just a struggle between two clans. It was a battle that would ultimately reshape the structure of Japanese society. The end of the war marked the rise of the Kamakura shogunate, a new era in Japanese history. In this new world, the samurai class would take center stage, and the ideals of Bushido would become deeply ingrained in the culture of Japan. Tomoe Gozen, as one of the few women to ever achieve such prominence within this warrior class, would remain an enduring figure in the story of the samurai. Her story, though tragically incomplete, would serve as a beacon for future generations. Tomoe's refusal to accept the traditional roles assigned to women, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and her unflinching dedication to the principles of honor and loyalty would make her a model for generations of warriors. Her name would live on in the annals of history as one of the most remarkable and inspiring figures of the Genpei War. In the years that followed the war, Tomoe's story would be passed down through the generations, celebrated in songs, poems, and stories. Her exploits would be woven into the fabric of Japan's samurai tradition, a testament to the enduring power of the individual spirit. Whether she lived to see the rise of the Kamakura shogunate or passed into obscurity, her legacy would endure, reminding future generations that true honor is not determined by gender, birth, or status, but by the strength of one's character and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. Tomoe Gozen, the warrior woman who defied the conventions of her time, would forever be remembered as a symbol of strength, courage, and resilience, an unyielding force whose impact transcended the battles she fought and the wars she fought in. The dust of the Genpei War had barely settled when Japan began to take its first steps toward a new era, one marked by the rise of the Kamakura shogunate and the dominance of the samurai class. The Terra, triumphant in the final battles, had claimed the imperial throne, but their victory, as it turned out, was short-lived. As the Taira fell into their own internal struggles, the Minamoto forces would eventually reassert themselves, culminating in the establishment of a military government that would lay the foundations for centuries of samurai rule. For Tomoe Gozen, whose name had become synonymous with the ideals of loyalty and honor, the question of what would become of her in this shifting world was left unanswered. Though the war was over, her place in history was far from secured, and her journey had yet to reach its conclusion. After the Minamoto's defeat and the eventual rise of the Kamakura shogunate, many of the warriors who had once fought under Yoshinaka, including Tomoe, found themselves adrift. The conflict that had once united them now left them scattered and without a clear cause. While some samurai joined the new regime under Minamoto no Yoritomo, others sought to live out quieter lives, away from the violence that had defined their existence for so long. Tomoe's fate, however, remained unclear. Her remarkable skills on the battlefield and her unwavering loyalty to the Minamoto cause had made her one of the most respected warriors of her time. But now that the Minamoto had been displaced, she was forced to adapt to a world that no longer required her expertise. With the Minamoto clan broken, Tomoe found herself living in the shadow of a war that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. She had been a warrior for as long as she could remember, and the life of a samurai, with its strict code of honor and its ceaseless call to battle, was all she had ever known. Now, in a time of relative peace, Tomoe faced a new challenge. What to do with her life when there were no more wars to fight, no more enemies to vanquish? This question would haunt her for the remainder of her days. The life of a warrior was one that defined everything, from personal relationships to identity itself. Now that this world was gone, what remained of Tomoe Gozen? Many stories about Tomoe's life after the war suggest that she sought seclusion. The idea of a warrior, a woman who had been so central to the Minamoto struggle, retreating from the world seems almost paradoxical. Yet, it was perhaps the only choice left for her. Some accounts suggest that Tomoe withdrew to a remote mountain temple or village, choosing to live out the rest of her days away from the chaos of the world. In this retreat, she would have found solace in the peace of nature, perhaps even in the quiet contemplation of her past. The very idea of this retreat, of Tomoe stepping away from the life of a warrior to become something else, speaks to the internal struggle she must have faced. She had fought with ferocity, leading armies and commanding the respect of her fellow warriors. Yet now, when all had been lost, she was left to reconcile the violent, turbulent years of her past with the reality of the present. Tomoe may have sought peace, but peace was not something easily found by someone who had spent a lifetime immersed in conflict. The warrior ethos ran deep within her. She had been trained for battle, and that training had defined her life. The transition from the battlefield to a quiet existence must have been fraught with difficulty, as the very skills that had brought her glory now seemed irrelevant in a world that no longer valued them. For many of the samurai who survived the war, the transition from war to peace was no less difficult. The samurai were a class that defined itself through its combat prowess, and with the end of the war, many found themselves adrift. However, while some samurai chose to embrace the new world under the Kamakura shogunate, others, like Tomoe, could not adjust. The society that had once honored warriors for their courage now demanded loyalty to the state, and for someone like Tomoe, whose life had been defined by personal loyalty to a fallen clan, the new order must have seemed alien. One of the central tensions of Tomoe's life after the war likely stemmed from her identity as a woman in a male-dominated world. During the war, she had been an exception, not just in her martial skill, but in her defiance of societal expectations. Now, in a time of peace, her position in society must have seemed uncertain. While her name was known far and wide, her place in the new world was far from assured. In an era when women were typically excluded from the world of politics and war, Tomoe's exceptional status made her a figure of fascination and respect, but it also placed her on the fringes of society. Despite this, Tomoe's influence was not completely erased by the passage of time. Her story lived on, passed down through the generations as a symbol of defiance, strength, and resilience. Even as she faded from the historical record, her legend continued to inspire. Over the centuries, Tomoe would come to symbolize the idea that strength is not bound by gender, and that a woman could achieve the highest honors within the warrior class. Her name was immortalized in stories, plays, and historical accounts, becoming one of the most enduring figures in Japan's rich samurai tradition. Her legacy would remain a beacon for those who believe that honor could not be defined by birth, and that courage could be found in the most unexpected of places. In the end, the historical record is silent on the specifics of Tomoe Gozen's later years. Some accounts suggest that she died in seclusion, living out the rest of her life away from the public eye. Others speculate that she may have taken up a more active role in the formation of the Kamakura shogunate, offering her wisdom and experience to the new ruling class. While her ultimate fate remains a mystery, her legacy is undeniable. Tomoe Gozen's life is a testament to the transformative power of individual will and to the idea that the qualities that define a true warrior, courage, loyalty, and perseverance, are not bound by the constraints of gender or social expectation. Tomoe's story has transcended the centuries, evolving from the tale of a remarkable woman to a symbol of resistance against the constraints placed on individuals by society. She has become a figure whose legacy continues to inspire, reminding us that the true measure of strength is not in the weapon one wields, but in the courage and honor that define one's character. The story of Tomoe Gozen, the samurai woman who defied the odds and fought against the limitations of her time, remains a powerful and enduring one, reminding us all that the fight for justice, for honor, and for one's place in history is never truly over. The years following the end of the Genpei War marked a period of profound change, both for Japan and for those who had played pivotal roles in the conflict. With the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, a new order arose, one dominated by the samurai and the military class. The Taira clan, which had enjoyed imperial favor for a time, had been wiped from the pages of history, and the Minamoto, though victorious, were also left with the burden of rebuilding a fractured nation. It was in this shifting landscape that Tomoe Gozen, the warrior woman whose name had become synonymous with strength and honor, had to find her place. The battlefield had shaped her life, but now, in the aftermath of the war, Tomoe was forced to confront the question that had haunted many of her fellow samurai. What would they become when there were no more wars to fight? Though the war was over and the Minamoto clan had, in a sense, triumphed, the victory was bittersweet. The price of victory had been high. Many of Tomoe's comrades were lost, and the once strong Minamoto forces were scattered across the land. For Tomoe herself, the war had been a lifelong journey of sacrifice and loss, a battle not only for survival, but for a higher cause. She had fought not just to win battles, but to uphold the ideals of loyalty, courage, and honor. These principles had defined her existence as a warrior, and as the last echoes of battle faded into the background, the question arose: how would she continue to live in a world where her purpose was no longer as clear? Despite the changes sweeping through Japan, Tomoe's role as a warrior woman remained central to her identity. She was a living legend, revered not only for her unmatched prowess in combat, but also for the audacity with which she had defied the traditional roles assigned to women in samurai society. Tomoe had never fit the mold of the ideal woman in her time. Her name had been forged in the fires of war, and her legacy was a testament to the idea that strength was not bound by gender or societal expectations. Yet, now that the war was over, the question remained: could she continue to carve out her place in a society that had little space for women like her? As the Kamakura shogunate began to solidify its power, the world of the samurai underwent a transformation. The new government, headed by Minamoto no Yoritomo, was focused on consolidating power and securing its rule over Japan. The country, which had long been divided by warring factions, now sought unity under a military regime. The samurai, who had once been scattered across the land in service to their lords, now found themselves subject to a centralized authority. The age of feudal warlords was giving way to a more organized and structured society. However, this new world presented both opportunities and limitations for warriors like Tomoe Gozen. For Tomoe, the world that had once seemed so full of purpose and clarity was now a place of uncertainty. Her military career had been built on the ideals of the Genpei War, the battle for supremacy between the Taira and the Minamoto, a struggle that had defined her existence for years. But now, as the samurai entered a time of relative peace, her role as a warrior no longer had a clear function. There were no longer great battles to be fought, no larger causes to rally behind. In this new world, Tomoe, like many other samurai, had to find a way to adapt to the changing times. Some warriors, particularly those who had been aligned with the Taira, found themselves sidelined, their skills deemed irrelevant in a society that now prioritized peace over war. Others, like Tomoe, had the opportunity to integrate into the new structure of the Kamakura shogunate, either by finding new roles as military advisors, administrators, or protectors of the new order. But for Tomoe, the choice was not so simple. While she could have sought a role in the shogunate, her fierce loyalty to the ideals of the Minamoto made it difficult to simply abandon the past. The Minamoto were still a central part of her identity, and she had fought for their vision of a just society. To join forces with the new shogunate, even under the leadership of Yoritomo, would be a kind of betrayal. It was a dilemma that few could have understood, but one that Tomoe, shaped by years of loyalty and honor, could not easily ignore. In some ways, Tomoe's situation mirrored that of many other samurai of her time. The older ways of warfare, with their emphasis on personal loyalty and the service of a single clan, were being replaced by a new order focused on centralized power and bureaucratic structures. The Kamakura shogunate, though born out of the warrior class, was establishing a government that was more than just a military dictatorship. It was a political entity that demanded compliance, structure, and order. It was a world that was increasingly inhospitable to the traditional, individualistic warrior ethos that had defined Tomoe's generation. Though her future was uncertain, Tomoe's reputation remained untarnished. In a world where honor was everything, her place in history was secure. She had fought valiantly for the Minamoto cause, and in the eyes of many, she would forever be remembered as one of the greatest warriors of her time. Her name, etched in the annals of samurai history, was more than just a symbol of martial prowess. It was a reminder of the power of defiance, the ability to transcend the boundaries of gender, and the strength of will to fight for one's principles, no matter the cost. As the years passed, Tomoe's legend grew. Stories of her bravery and skill on the battlefield were recounted across Japan. Her deeds were celebrated in poems, songs, and plays, and she became a figure of inspiration for future generations of samurai. Tomoe's story, though rooted in the tumultuous years of the Genpei War, continued to resonate long after the war had ended. She was a figure who embodied the core values of the samurai code: loyalty, courage, and honor. Yet, her legacy was more than just the story of a warrior. It was the story of a woman who had refused to be bound by the constraints of her time, a woman who had shown the world that greatness was not determined by gender or birth, but by the strength of one's spirit. Even as the political landscape of Japan shifted and the samurai adapted to the new realities of the Kamakura shogunate, Tomoe Gozen's legacy remained a powerful force. She had lived through some of the most violent and tumultuous years in Japanese history, and her role in those events ensured that she would never be forgotten. Her story was one of resilience, of a woman who had fought against the expectations of society and emerged as one of the most respected warriors of her time. The quiet life that Tomoe may have chosen in the aftermath of the war, whether in seclusion or in service to another cause, is lost to history. But what endures is the image of a woman who stood tall in the face of overwhelming odds, who carved out a place for herself in a world that had not intended to make room for her. Tomoe Gozen's name continues to live on in the hearts of those who revere the samurai tradition, and her legacy, far from fading, grows ever more powerful with the passage of time. In the end, her story is not just one of a warrior, but of a symbol of the enduring power of the human spirit to challenge the limits imposed by society and to carve out one's own destiny, no matter the obstacles in the way. As the years rolled by, the landscape of Japan shifted in ways that none of its warriors, least of all Tomoe Gozen, could have predicted. The Kamakura shogunate, though established in the wake of the Genpei War's bloodshed, was far from a settled power. The Minamoto clan, once the vanguard of the war against the Taira, had now succeeded in creating a new military government, but with it came fresh challenges. Though the fighting had subsided, the problems of governance, land control, and loyalty were far from resolved. In the midst of this turbulent time, Tomoe found herself an enigma, a figure who had once shaped the course of history, but now had to navigate the complexities of a new world, one that no longer needed her in the same way. The clash of old ideals and new realities created a profound tension in her life. What role could she play now, in an era that seemed to have no room for a warrior like her? The Kamakura shogunate was born out of the very bloodshed that Tomoe had lived through. The rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would become the first shogun of the new regime, promised to bring stability to a fractured nation. However, the road to that stability was not as straightforward as many had hoped. Yoritomo's shogunate, though powerful, faced threats from within and from neighboring clans. Rivalries and intrigues abounded, and the centralization of power in the hands of the samurai created a new set of struggles. Yet, amid these political shifts, Tomoe Gozen's fate remained uncertain. She was a symbol of the past, an iconic warrior who had once embodied the values of loyalty, courage, and the indomitable will of the samurai. But now, in the time of the Kamakura shogunate, what role did she have left to play? Tomoe's presence on the battlefield had been legendary. Her exploits during the Genpei War had made her a figure of awe, a rare woman who had proved herself not only as a fierce warrior, but as a leader among men. Her name had been etched into the records of history, alongside the greatest samurai of her time. But as the war receded into the past, the world of the samurai was changing. The Kamakura shogunate was defined by a new kind of authority, one focused more on maintaining peace and control than on the chaotic battles that had once consumed the country. While many samurai, particularly those aligned with the Minamoto cause, found new positions within the shogunate, others, like Tomoe, were left to grapple with what their place in this new world might be. The role of women in samurai society had always been complex. While some women, like Tomoe, had been granted the rare opportunity to fight alongside men, the majority of women were relegated to domestic roles, their lives confined to the household. Even a woman as remarkable as Tomoe could not escape the confines of societal expectation. In the years following the Genpei War, it's unclear whether she sought any official position within the shogunate or if she lived a more solitary life. Some sources suggest that Tomoe may have chosen seclusion, retreating from the public eye after the war's tumult. She may have found solace in the quietude of nature, or perhaps she sought to enter a temple, leaving the violence and bloodshed behind her. In this new era, peace had its own set of demands and challenges, and not all warriors could reconcile themselves with the end of the old world. Still, Tomoe's legend was far from fading. Even in an era where war had given way to political maneuvering and the consolidation of power, her story continued to resonate. In the wake of the Genpei War, the Minamoto's victory had been hard-earned, and many of those who had fought beside them, including Tomoe, were remembered with reverence. She became a symbol not only of martial prowess, but also of the potential of women to break the mold of their time. Her name was immortalized in the sagas and ballads of the period, passed down through generations as a representation of courage and defiance. Tomoe Gozen, the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the fiercest warriors of the age, would continue to inspire long after the blood of the Genpei War had dried. Yet, despite her legendary status, the changing political landscape must have weighed heavily on her. The Kamakura shogunate was built on military power, but its focus was on maintaining control over the fragmented territories of Japan, not on engaging in the kind of large-scale warfare that had defined the previous decades. The new order was centered around stability, landholding, and the complex relationships between lords and their vassals. The shogunate needed warriors who could maintain order, administer land, and govern effectively. These were not roles that required a figure like Tomoe Gozen, whose life had been shaped by the whirlwind of battle and the visceral demands of war. This shift from the age of warlords to the age of shoguns must have felt like a profound rupture for Tomoe. She had been a central player in the war for the Minamoto clan, a force on the battlefield who had earned the respect of even her male counterparts. But now, in this new era, her role seemed uncertain. While her past accomplishments could not be erased, they no longer seemed to have any relevance in a world that had moved past the need for warriors like her. The warrior ethos, defined by personal loyalty to a lord and the willingness to fight to the death for one's cause, was now intertwined with a broader, more complex system of governance. For someone like Tomoe, whose entire identity had been shaped by her status as a warrior, this transformation of the samurai class must have been both a source of frustration and a cause for reflection. The personal glory and battlefield heroism that had once been her primary motivation were no longer as central to the lives of the samurai. The Kamakura shogunate required loyalty not just in battle, but in the service of a state that demanded submission to central authority and a redefined understanding of power. And yet, Tomoe Gozen's legacy was far from being relegated to the past. While the political structures of the Kamakura shogunate had changed, the ideals of samurai loyalty, honor, and courage had not been erased. These values were the foundation of the new regime. It was through these values that Tomoe's story continued to inspire. She had been a warrior of exceptional skill, but it was her unwavering commitment to the Minamoto cause and her devotion to the principles of honor that truly set her apart. She became, in many ways, the embodiment of the samurai ideal, one who transcended gender, defied convention, and fought with every ounce of her being for a cause she believed in. Her story, passed down through the generations, would continue to serve as a model for future samurai, both male and female. In a society where the samurai class was increasingly being integrated into the workings of government and peacekeeping, Tomoe Gozen's example of unyielding resolve would resonate with those who believed that the true measure of a warrior was not just in battle, but in the courage to adapt to a changing world while staying true to the values that defined one's character. In the years that followed the Genpei War, Tomoe Gozen remained a figure of fascination. Her name lived on in the folktales and historical chronicles of Japan, where she was remembered as a fierce and loyal warrior who had defied the norms of her time. While the records of her later years remained sparse, the myth of Tomoe endured. She became a symbol of defiance and strength, a reminder that true warriors do not fade into obscurity but leave an indelible mark on the world. In the end, Tomoe's life after the war is as much a part of her legacy as her deeds during the conflict. While the political landscape of Japan shifted and the need for warriors like her diminished, Tomoe Gozen's place in history remained secure. She was not just a figure of the past. She was a symbol of the timeless values of courage, loyalty, and honor, values that would continue to guide the samurai for centuries to come. The years that followed the rise of the Kamakura shogunate brought both stability and growing complexity to Japan, and with them, the final traces of the Genpei War slowly faded into history. Yet for Tomoe Gozen, the world was still defined by a much different reality. The woman who had once stood at the forefront of the Minamoto cause, battling alongside the most formidable samurai of her time, found herself navigating a world that had moved past the violent conflicts that had shaped her identity. The samurai, long synonymous with warriors who fought on horseback and wielded their swords with unmatched precision, were now part of a newly established regime, one that demanded more than just prowess in battle. It demanded loyalty to a new order and adherence to the rules of governance and law that were taking root across the land. As Japan entered this new chapter of its history, many of the warriors who had fought in the Genpei War, including Tomoe, had to come to terms with a society that was changing rapidly, one that seemed less and less interested in the heroic ideals they had once upheld. No longer were there grand battles to fight, no enemies to face in glorious combat. The samurai of the Kamakura period were now tasked with maintaining order, collecting taxes, and performing duties that had little to do with the swordplay and honor of their past lives. Tomoe, a woman whose name had once been spoken with reverence on the battlefield, found herself in a world where the things she valued most, honor, loyalty, and combat, were now being reshaped into something more bureaucratic. Tomoe's reputation, however, remained unshaken. She had proven herself as one of the greatest warriors of her time, and her feats in the Genpei War were still recounted in whispers by those who remembered her valor. But as the shogunate established its control, the role of the samurai began to shift. The fierce, independent warriors who had once dominated the battlefields were now required to live under the increasingly rigid structures of law and governance. Tomoe, a living symbol of the old ways, had to confront a question that many of her peers also grappled with. What purpose did a warrior like her serve in a world that no longer relied on war? Her exact fate after the war is lost to history, but it is clear that Tomoe's life after the Genpei War was shaped by this internal conflict. Some accounts suggest that, in her later years, Tomoe might have chosen to withdraw from public life altogether. The idea that she retreated into seclusion, either to a quiet mountain village or a remote temple, gives a sense of peace, but also hints at the inner struggle that she may have faced. A life of meditation, perhaps, would allow Tomoe to reconcile with the conflict she had experienced, to reflect on the years spent in battle and the loss of the Minamoto clan, who had once been her family in arms. It is possible that she sought some measure of tranquility, hoping to distance herself from the tumultuous life that had defined her. Yet even in seclusion, she would not have been free from the weight of the past. Her name was still legendary, and her place in the history of Japan's samurai tradition was already cemented. Even in retirement, Tomoe's story would continue to shape the future. Her legacy was not one of conquest or political power. It was a legacy of courage, self-determination, and defiance of the roles that society had set for her. In a world that had demanded so much from her, Tomoe had shown that a woman could be as fierce, as loyal, and as skilled as any man. In a time when samurai were expected to be paragons of virtue, Tomoe embodied the ideal that one's worth was not defined by gender, but by action and honor. These ideals would be passed down through generations of warriors, and in time, Tomoe would become an icon, a symbol not just of the Minamoto cause, but of the samurai way of life itself.